The Harrington estate was the kind of place people whispered about even when they drove past the gates. Sprawling acres of manicured lawns, marble fountains imported from Italy, chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a palace. It was the setting where wealth didn't just speak, it roared. Tonight, those gates opened wide for an exclusive dinner party hosted by one of the city's most talked-about couples. Billionaire investor Richard Harrington and his wife, Eleanor. On the surface, it was just another night of networking, champagne, and polished small talk. But for Eleanor, these dinners were her battlefield. She lived for the subtle competitions, whose dress sparkled brightest, whose wine collection outshone the others, whose chef left her guests raving. She wasn't just trying to entertain, she was determined to prove she was at the top of the social ladder. And that's where Marcus came in. Marcus wasn't the typical private chef Eleanor usually hired. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear a gold-trimmed jacket or brag about celebrity clients. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his chef whites crisp and spotless, his demeanor calm. To anyone paying attention, it was obvious he knew what he was doing. To Eleanor, however, all she saw was a problem. Marcus was black. The moment he stepped into her kitchen, carrying his knives in a sleek leather roll, Eleanor's lips tightened. She looked him up and down as if he had wandered into the wrong house. "You're the chef?" she asked, her voice dripping with doubt. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied evenly. His voice was smooth, polite, without a trace of defensiveness. Eleanor crossed her arms, her diamonds catching the light. Well, I hope you understand this isn't the kind of crowd for exotic dishes. We'll need something traditional. White people food? You know, steak, potatoes, maybe a Caesar salad. Nothing too unfamiliar." The air in the room shifted. Her words hung heavy, sharp enough that even the staff nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus, however, didn't flinch. He simply gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "Of course," he said calmly. "Dinner will be served as requested." But inside, a quiet fire flickered. Eleanor didn't notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She was already bustling out of the kitchen, barking orders at the house staff, adjusting flower arrangements, and rehearsing her polite laugh for the evening's conversations. She hadn't even asked Marcus about his background, his training, or what kind of experience he brought to the table. To her, all that mattered was appearance. And in her eyes, he didn't fit her picture of refinement. The irony, of course, was staggering. Marcus wasn't just a chef, he was a master, trained in Paris, with stints in Tokyo and London. He had dedicated decades to his craft. His restaurants held 3 Michelin stars, a mark of culinary excellence that fewer than 1% of chefs in the world would ever touch. He had cooked for presidents, kings, and celebrities who waited months just to taste his food. Tonight, however, he was reduced to make white people food. As Marcus unpacked his knives and ingredients, he let his mind settle into the rhythm he knew best. Cooking for him wasn't just work. It was art, discipline, and meditation all in one. He had faced critics sharper than Eleanor's words, and each time he had let his dishes speak louder than any insult. Tonight would be no different. Meanwhile, Eleanor pranced around the estate, greeting early arrivals with air kisses and exaggerated compliments. Her guests were exactly the crowd she craved. Hedge fund managers, socialites, and a sprinkling of politicians who owed their careers to people like Richard. They admired her diamonds, praised her taste in decor, and humored her long stories about summers in the south of France. But beneath the surface, there was always the quiet scrutiny. In this world, one wrong move, a bland appetizer, a poorly chosen wine, could unravel the image she worked so hard to maintain. And Eleanor, for all her confidence, lived in fear of that unraveling. By the time Marcus began working through the courses, Eleanor made her way back into the kitchen to check on things. She leaned against the counter, watching him with a smirk. "You're not going to overcomplicate this, are you?" she asked. "I don't want anything artsy, just food people recognize. Not everyone likes spices." Marcus kept chopping herbs with fluid precision, the knife rhythmically tapping the board. "Dinner will be simple, ma'am," he said. "Good," Eleanor said, satisfied with her own authority. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I suppose you've done this before, haven't you? Or is this your first big event?" Marcus set his knife down and looked at her for the first time since she'd walked in. His eyes were steady, calm, with the faintest glimmer of amusement. "It's not my first," he replied. That was all. No elaboration, no defensive explanation. Just a quiet truth Eleanor didn't recognize for the weight it carried. Satisfied with what she thought was control, Eleanor turned on her heel and floated back to her guests, oblivious to the storm of humility waiting just hours away. because while she was busy plotting her victory over her rivals, Marcus was preparing something else entirely, a dinner so flawless it would dismantle her arrogance bite by bite. And when the truth of who he was finally came out, Eleanor wouldn't just lose face. She would be the centerpiece of a story that her elite circle would whisper about for years. The night had only begun, but the stage was set. The kitchen of the Harrington estate was built to impress. Stainless steel appliances gleamed under crystal light fixtures. The marble counters stretched wider than some apartments, and the pantry looked more like a boutique grocery store. To Eleanor, it was a symbol of wealth. To Marcus, it was simply another workspace. He moved through it with quiet mastery, laying out his ingredients in neat rows. Every movement was deliberate, every tool placed exactly where he needed it. Years of training had refined his process until it was almost like choreography, each step flowing seamlessly into the next. Eleanor, however, didn't see artistry. She saw a man she couldn't control. She reappeared not long after the first round of cocktails had been served in the drawing room. The faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses carried through the halls, but she had left her guests to supervise. Arms folded, she hovered near the doorway, watching Marcus prep vegetables with surgical precision. "You're not planning anything too fancy, are you?" she asked, her tone sharp and suspicious. Marcus didn't look up. "Dinner will be exactly as you requested." She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor. "I just want to make sure, because I've seen chefs like you before, always trying to prove something, putting foam on everything, making little dots on plates, serving food that looks like art instead of a meal. My guests aren't interested in experiments. They want food they know." Marcus's knife continued its steady rhythm. He didn't rise to her bait. Unsatisfied with his silence, Eleanor pressed further. "Honestly, I was surprised when Richard hired you. I thought we'd be getting someone with a little more pedigree. No offense, of course." It was the kind of comment designed to sting, to put him in his place. But Marcus had faced critics far sharper than her. French masters who could dismantle a dish with a single raised eyebrow. Japanese chefs who demanded perfection down to the millimeter. Eleanor's jabs barely registered. Still, her words weren't lost on the staff. The butler exchanged an uncomfortable glance with the housekeeper, both shifting uneasily in the corner. They had worked for Eleanor long enough to know her arrogance had no ceiling. But tonight, even for her, it felt especially cruel. Marcus continued prepping. He marinated the beef, peeled and shaved vegetables into delicate ribbons, and blended sauces with effortless grace. The kitchen filled with aromas: garlic, thyme, butter, the faint sweetness of caramelizing onions. Even the house staff, accustomed to lavish meals, found themselves inhaling deeply, eyes widening at the complexity. Eleanor sniffed. "It smells strong. Are you sure you're not overdoing it? I don't want anyone choking on spices." The butler nearly rolled his eyes, but Marcus remained unshaken. "Everything is balanced, ma'am," he said evenly. Her lips curved into a smirk. "Well, I hope so. I mean, what do you normally cook? Fried chicken? Collard greens? That sort of thing?" The words were sharper this time, intentional in their insult. The room seemed to freeze. The housekeeper stiffened, her face tightening with disapproval. Even Eleanor's own assistant, who had followed her in, glanced nervously at Marcus, waiting for some kind of reaction. But Marcus didn't give her the satisfaction. He simply continued working, sliding herbs into a simmering sauce, his expression calm. His silence was more powerful than any rebuttal could have been. Eleanor mistook it for weakness. She chuckled, shaking her head. "Well, as long as you can manage steak and potatoes, I suppose it'll be fine. Just don't try to get creative." She swept out of the room again, leaving a trail of perfume and arrogance in her wake. The moment she was gone, the housekeeper whispered under her breath, "Unbelievable." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "It's all right," he said softly. "Dinner will take care of itself," and he meant it. He knew the truth of his skill. He knew what it meant to hold not just one, but 3 Michelin stars. He had spent years mastering the balance between tradition and innovation, discipline and creativity. Eleanor didn't need to believe in him. Her disbelief would only make her humiliation sharper when the truth came out. As the hours passed, the kitchen became a theater of transformation. Racks of raw ingredients turned into dishes that looked like paintings. Velvety sauces poured with precision, meats seared to perfection, vegetables carved and plated with elegance. The staff who passed through the kitchen to fetch trays or refill glasses couldn't help but stop and stare. They whispered among themselves, marveling at the beauty of the dishes, at the way Marcus worked without hesitation, without chaos, as though he were conducting an orchestra only he could hear. Meanwhile, in the drawing room, Eleanor was in her element. She laughed a little too loudly at her guests' jokes, bragged about her European vacations, and casually dropped references to her husband's latest business acquisitions. Yet beneath the surface she was restless. Every few minutes her eyes darted toward the kitchen, as though she feared Marcus might sabotage her dinner out of spite. Her friends, unaware of her remarks earlier, trusted she had hired the best. After all, Eleanor prided herself on taste. They sipped their wine, expecting a flawless meal, and Eleanor, smug in her assumption that Marcus couldn't deliver, prepared herself to play the victim if things went wrong. But things weren't going wrong. They were going perfectly. By the time the first course was ready, Marcus had assembled a menu that walked the fine line Eleanor demanded. Classic dishes, but elevated to a level none of her guests had experienced before. A simple potato, transformed into a golden soufflé. A salad that looked ordinary at first glance, but revealed layers of delicate flavor with every bite. A steak so tender it could be cut with a spoon, paired with a sauce that whispered of hours of technique. It wasn't white people food. It was universal excellence, the kind of cooking that transcended boundaries and silenced critics. And when it reached the dining table, Eleanor would discover just how little she understood the man she had tried to belittle. The insults had been thrown, the barbs delivered. But Marcus wasn't a man who fought with words. His battlefield was the plate, and the war was only about to begin. When the butler finally announced that dinner was ready, the chatter in the drawing room quieted with eager anticipation. Eleanor's guests, a collection of CEOs, society wives, and one or two minor celebrities, rose from their seats and drifted toward the long mahogany dining table. Candles flickered in crystal holders, silverware gleamed, and the air carried the faintest trace of roasted herbs wafting in from the kitchen. Eleanor walked at the head of the group, chin tilted proudly. In her mind, the meal would serve one purpose: to show off her wealth. Food was never about taste to her. It was a symbol, another way to remind her circle of friends that she had the resources to summon a private chef on a whim. What she didn't realize was that her own arrogance had set the stage for something she couldn't control. Marcus entered silently, carrying the first course on polished trays with the assistance of the house staff. The plates were set down one by one, each revealed like a small masterpiece. At first glance, the dishes looked deceptively simple. A potato soufflé crowned with a whisper of truffle. A salad arranged with crisp greens and thin slices of pear glistening under a delicate vinaigrette. The guests leaned forward, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Forks lifted. And then with the first bites, the room shifted. "Oh, my," murmured one guest, a woman with a diamond necklace heavy enough to strain her neck. Another man, a venture capitalist who rarely bothered with compliments, said between chews, "This is extraordinary." Conversation stalled as the flavors sank in, velvety, balanced, familiar yet transformed. It wasn't pretension on a plate. It was memory elevated, the comfort of potato and greens, but refined to a level most of them had never tasted. Eleanor forced a laugh. Well, it's just potatoes and lettuce. Nothing special, but no one was listening. Her guests were already enchanted. The second course arrived. A delicate seafood medley with hints of saffron, plated with an elegance that drew gasps. The flavors unfolded like a story. First the freshness of the sea, then the warmth of the spice, ending with a silky finish that lingered on the tongue. One of the women leaned toward Eleanor. "Darling, where did you find him? This is better than Le Bernardin." Eleanor's smile faltered. "Oh, well, you know. Richard has connections," she stammered, trying to maintain control of the narrative. But her eyes flickered toward Marcus, who was quietly retreating back to the kitchen, and she felt a pang of unease. She had expected him to stumble, to embarrass himself, to prove her low opinion correct. Instead, he was stealing the spotlight she craved. By the time the main course arrived, a perfectly seared filet mignon, paired with a red wine reduction so rich it seemed to stop time, Eleanor was desperate. She picked up her fork, stabbed at the meat, and announced loudly, "I did ask for something simple. Sometimes chefs forget people just want a straightforward meal. This, well, it's fine, but I would have preferred plain steak and mashed potatoes." The attempt at dismissal rang hollow. The table was buzzing with praise. One man declared it the best beef he'd ever eaten. Another guest asked if Marcus had a restaurant they could visit. Even Richard, who usually stayed quiet to avoid contradicting his wife, muttered, "This is outstanding." Eleanor's smile stiffened into something brittle. She tried again, this time turning her attention directly to Marcus as he returned to clear plates. "Tell me, did you learn to cook? What's the word? Soul food growing up? Or was this something you picked up later, trying to branch out?" The room went silent. Forks hovered midair. Everyone knew the weight of her words, the venom tucked behind her saccharine smile. Marcus paused, his expression serene. He met her eyes for a brief moment, but instead of responding, he turned to the butler. "Shall we bring out the next course?" The butler nodded quickly, grateful for the chance to break the tension. The staff swept in, replacing plates with the next creation. A dessert course that was nothing short of art. A chocolate soufflé, its edges rising flawlessly above the rim of the ramekin, paired with a drizzle of raspberry coulis and a quenelle of vanilla bean ice cream so smooth it looked sculpted. When the guests cracked into the soufflé and the rich chocolate poured out like silk, gasps and delighted laughter filled the room. "This is divine," exclaimed one guest. "Positively divine." Another woman dabbed at her lips with a napkin. "Eleanor, you've outdone yourself this time." But Eleanor could barely muster a reply. Her attempts to diminish Marcus had failed, each course driving the guests further under his spell. They weren't talking about her art collection, her jewelry, or her travels anymore. The conversation had shifted entirely, revolving around Marcus's food, Marcus's skill, Marcus's genius. And then came the moment she couldn't have anticipated. One of the guests, a silver-haired man who had spent much of the evening quietly savoring each bite, set down his fork and leaned forward. His voice carried authority, the kind of tone that made others listen. "I've had this food before," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing as if piecing together a memory. "Years ago, in Paris, at a small restaurant tucked near the Champs-Élysées." The table stilled. "Yes," he continued, nodding to himself. "I remember now. It was called Maison du Ciel. I dined there twice during Fashion Week. The chef was extraordinary, earned 3 Michelin stars. Surely." He turned his gaze on Marcus. "Surely that was you." Eleanor laughed nervously. "Don't be ridiculous. Our chef here is local." But the man ignored her. His eyes were locked on Marcus, waiting for confirmation. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Maison du Ciel was mine, for 8 years. A murmur rippled across the table. Forks clinked against plates as guests exchanged wide-eyed looks. The weight of his words settled over them like a revelation. Marcus continued, not boastfully, but matter of fact. "I trained in Paris, Tokyo, New York, and London. I've served presidents, kings, and prime ministers. Maison du Ciel was one of my restaurants, and it was awarded 3 Michelin stars during my tenure." The silence that followed was deafening, and then, all at once, the table erupted. Exclamations of disbelief, questions tumbling over each other, admiration pouring in from every corner. Only Eleanor remained frozen, her face pale, her carefully maintained smugness crumbling in front of her closest friends. For a moment, the dining room was a portrait of stunned silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. Crystal glasses caught the flickering light, casting fractured reflections on the polished wood table. All eyes were locked on Marcus, as if seeing him for the first time. The silver-haired guest leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I knew it," he said with quiet satisfaction. "I told my wife at the time. It was the finest meal I'd ever had. And here you are, in New York, in the Harringtons' dining room." The murmur of conversation grew, voices overlapping with awe. "You own a Michelin-starred restaurant? 3 stars, did he say 3? Maison du Ciel. Oh my God, I've read about it in Le Guide." Compliments flowed toward Marcus like a tide, each one swelling higher. He stood quietly, hands folded behind his back, the very picture of composure. He wasn't boastful, but neither was he shrinking. He let the truth of his work speak louder than any defense he could have made earlier. At the head of the table, Eleanor tried to regain control. She clinked her fork against her wineglass. "Well, that's charming," she said, forcing a brittle laugh. "But I'm sure you're exaggerating. Michelin stars are hardly?" interrupted the silver-haired man, his voice sharp. "Eleanor, do you even realize what you're saying? There are fewer than 150 restaurants in the world with 3 Michelin stars. And he gestured toward Marcus with reverence. "He ran one of them." Another guest chimed in, eyes alight with excitement. "Maison du Ciel was legendary. I never managed to get a reservation. People booked months, sometimes a year in advance." "Eleanor, do you understand what kind of talent you have in your kitchen tonight?" The weight of their words bore down on Eleanor like a stone. She tried to wave it off, tried to laugh along as though she had known all along, but her voice wavered, her smile strained. "Well, of course, I knew he had some experience. But we wanted something simple tonight, nothing too extravagant." The guests weren't buying it. They were too busy directing their admiration toward Marcus. One leaned forward eagerly. "Chef, do you still own the restaurant? Where are you cooking now?" "Please tell us where we can find your work," Marcus answered with humility. "Maison du Ciel is still open, though I've stepped back from the day-to-day operations. I consult and occasionally guest chef. At the moment, I work privately for select clients who seek discretion and quality." Gasps of envy followed. Select clients, someone repeated, shaking their head in disbelief. Eleanor, you're fortunate beyond measure. Richard Harrington, who had remained quiet throughout most of the evening, finally spoke. His voice carried an edge of embarrassment. Fortunate, yes, though I'd say my wife hasn't exactly treated our guest with the respect he deserves. A hush fell again. Eleanor's head whipped toward him, eyes wide with betrayal. Richard! But he didn't flinch. I heard what you said earlier, Eleanor. We all did. Asking him if he only knew how to fry chicken? His words cut through the room, sharp as glass. That was disgraceful. The butler shifted uncomfortably, and the housekeeper lowered her eyes, but neither denied it. The truth hung in the air like smoke, undeniable. Eleanor flushed crimson. She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Her guests were staring at her now, not with admiration, but with disapproval, judgment etched into their faces. The empire of status she had built so carefully in their eyes was crumbling. Marcus, however, remained unshaken. He inclined his head slightly toward Richard. Respect is earned, Mr. Harrington. Tonight was never about me. It was about the food and the company. The humility in his words only magnified the contrast. Where Eleanor had been small and petty, Marcus was expansive and gracious. Her arrogance looked uglier in the face of his calm dignity. The silver-haired guest raised his glass. To the chef, he declared. To Marcus, whose work humbles us all. The table followed suit, glasses lifted high, the toast echoing around the room. To the chef! Crystal clinked together, and the sound rang like a verdict. Eleanor didn't lift her glass. Her hand trembled against the tablecloth, her nails digging into the fabric. She could feel her reputation slipping through her fingers, undone in a single evening by her own cruelty. She had invited Marcus into her home thinking he was a prop for her vanity. Instead, he had become the centerpiece, and she the fool. Desperation clawed at her chest. She forced a laugh, brittle and thin. Well, I suppose even I can be surprised now and then. What a charming discovery. But the guests weren't fooled. They were leaning toward Marcus, peppering him with questions, asking about his travels, his inspirations, the secrets behind his dishes. Eleanor's attempts to recapture their attention fell flat. For the rest of the night, she was a ghost at her own party. As dessert plates were cleared and coffee was served, Marcus excused himself from the table with a polite bow. It has been my honor to cook for you all tonight, he said simply. The guests applauded, some even standing as he left the room. Eleanor, however, sat rigid, her face a mask of forced composure. Inside, she was unraveling. She had meant to humiliate Marcus, to assert her superiority. Instead, she had been exposed as petty, small-minded, and ignorant, while the man she tried to belittle stood taller than ever, and the whispers had already begun. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring about Eleanor's behavior, her insult, her downfall. She could feel their judgment burning into her skin. For the first time in her carefully curated life, Eleanor Harrington wasn't the star of her own evening. She was the cautionary tale. By the time coffee was poured and Petit's fours were set on the table, the Harrington dinner had transformed into something Eleanor had never intended. It was no longer her evening, her triumph, or her showcase. It belonged entirely to Marcus. Her guests, who usually fawned over her every detail, the cut of her dress, the sparkle of her diamonds, the price tag on her centerpieces, had turned away from her entirely. They leaned in toward Marcus, hanging on his every word as he answered questions with quiet authority. What was the hardest dish you ever perfected? One woman asked, eyes wide with admiration. Marcus smiled faintly. There's no single dish. Perfection is always the hardest part. It's a pursuit, not a destination. Another guest leaned forward eagerly. Did you really train in Tokyo? What was that like? I worked under a master who had been making sushi for 50 years, Marcus replied. He taught me discipline. That true respect for food begins with respect for people. Those words landed heavier than Eleanor anticipated. A subtle shift rippled around the table. Several guests darted glances in her direction, the implication clear. Respect for people. The phrase rang louder than the clinking of china. Eleanor forced a laugh. Well, isn't that sweet? Almost like a little fortune cookie, isn't it? The attempt fell flat. Nobody laughed with her. Richard's jaw tightened, his embarrassment for his wife plain. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. Marcus's quiet dignity was saying everything. As the night wore on, Eleanor grew more desperate. She tried to interject, to steer the conversation back to herself. Speaking of Tokyo, she said suddenly, her voice rising above the chatter. Richard and I spent a few days there last year. We stayed at the Ritz, simply divine service. Oh, and we had sushi too, of course. Very authentic. But her attempt to reclaim the spotlight only highlighted her shallowness. No one followed her lead. The questions went back to Marcus, back to his years of training, back to his Michelin stars, back to the man she had mocked as if he were beneath her. And then came the moment she dreaded most. One of her closest friends, a woman she often prided herself on impressing, leaned across the table with a sly smile. "Eleanor, dear, I must ask, did you truly tell him not to cook anything too, how did you put it, too ethnic?" The room stilled again. Forks paused midair. Every head turned toward Eleanor, her heart seized in her chest. "Well, no, of course not," she stammered. "That was just taken out of context." But the staff in the corner, who had overheard every word, exchanged knowing glances. The butler shifted uncomfortably. The housekeeper lowered her eyes but didn't hide her frown. It was clear enough to the guests what had really been said. Marcus did not gloat. He didn't need to. He only inclined his head and said softly but firmly, "Food is for everyone. There's no such thing as white food or black food. There's only good food, made with respect." The words landed like a gavel strike. It wasn't a speech, wasn't a lecture, just a truth spoken plainly, but its impact was devastating. One guest whispered to another, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "Can you believe she spoke to him like that?" Another murmured back, "Inexcusable. And in front of all of us." Eleanor's palms dampened, her throat tightening. She reached for her glass of wine, but her hand shook so much she nearly spilled it. She had lost them, all of them. The friends she counted on to reinforce her status were now looking at her with thinly veiled disgust. And Marcus, the man she tried to demean, stood taller than ever. When the final course was cleared and it was time for Marcus to take his leave, the guests erupted into applause. Several stood to shake his hand. One even asked for his private contact information, eager to secure his services for their own gatherings. Eleanor watched it unfold in horror. This was supposed to be her night, her victory lap. Instead, it was her undoing. As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused at the head of the table, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. He didn't sneer, didn't gloat, didn't even raise his voice. He simply said, "Mrs. Harrington, thank you for having me. I hope tonight was everything you wanted." The words were polite, but the sting was unmistakable. Everything she wanted? No, it had been everything she feared. Her guests chuckled softly, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. Eleanor's face burned as she forced a smile, her lips trembling with the effort. Richard muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "You did this to yourself." Marcus gave a final nod, collected his tools, and left the room with the quiet grace of a man who needed no audience, no validation. His work had spoken louder than any insult ever could, and Eleanor sat in the ruins of her own dinner party, her dream of superiority shattered by the very person she tried to diminish. It was not Marcus who left humbled that night. It was her. In the days that followed, Eleanor Harrington's dinner party became the talk of her circle. Not for its glamour, not for its exclusivity, but for her humiliating downfall. Guests who had once envied her wealth and followed her lead now whispered behind her back. Stories spread quickly. How she had insulted her chef, how she had questioned his skill, how she had tried to reduce him to a stereotype, only to be silenced by the revelation of his Michelin stars. By the end of the week, Eleanor's phone was quieter than ever. Invitations stopped arriving. The same people who once praised her taste now used her as a cautionary tale. Even Richard, embarrassed by the spectacle she had created, began distancing himself at social gatherings, no longer rushing to defend her vanity. For Marcus, however, the evening had the opposite effect. Word of his presence at the Harrington estate spread among the elite. Within days, he was contacted by several guests eager to book his services privately. A few even spoke of investing in his next restaurant venture. His reputation, already formidable in the culinary world, only grew stronger. He hadn't needed to argue with Eleanor, hadn't needed to raise his voice or demand respect. His food, his experience, and his composure had done all the speaking for him. Eleanor had tried to make him small, but in the end, she had only exposed her own pettiness. And Marcus walked away not just untouched by her insults, but elevated. A reminder that true talent doesn't bend to arrogance. It shines in spite of it. Her wealth had bought her chandeliers, estates and guests willing to flatter her. But it couldn't buy her dignity. And in the end, it was the man she underestimated who left with both dignity and triumph intact.